Hello, everyone, and welcome to Literature Reviews 101, part of our graduate student workshop series at LSU Libraries. I am Brittany O'Neill. I am the Humanities and Social Sciences librarian at LSU Libraries. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about the ins and outs of literature reviews and how to do them. So before we talk about that, let's talk a little bit about what is a literature review. So many of you may have done an annotated bibliography in the past with your research. They're not quite the same thing. Annotated bibliographies summarize individual sources on their own, whereas a literature review places all of those works in context. All of scholarship is a conversation, and you're making that conversation happen. It can be sort of a summary, but it's usually combined with some sort of synthesis. So you're figuring out what the author's big points are, what insights they're making that are unique, and how that can sort of converse with other works. It's often part of a research paper, but it can be freestanding. Many of you in graduate seminars may do literature reviews entirely on their own, but a lot of times they're part of things like articles or dissertations and theses. It describes what is already known in the literature and also presents what gaps in knowledge there are that you can then fit your research into. It informs the reader of existing scholarship that they may not have already read and emphasizes your credibility by having done that research. Literature reviews vary significantly between different disciplines. So I've given sort of a sampling of a few different disciplines. In the social sciences, literature reviews include data and statistics. They usually have some kind of organizational pattern. In the humanities, you're focusing more on primary sources than secondary sources, things like historical artifacts. Older articles are generally okay. In the humanities, knowledge does not necessarily change a whole lot over an extended period of time. In the sciences, that's not the case. This includes a lot of data and statistics, usually requires more recent research, and unlike those other areas, it's less interdisciplinary, so searching is a lot more focused. So what does this mean? You're going to have to look in multiple places, try multiple different search strategies, get organized with those, and somehow develop a way to manage the workload. But it's going to be okay. I'm going to give you all of the strategies to help manage that workload. So these are our stops on our route, on our map to literature reviews. We're going to learn about how to choose a researchable topic, how to develop search strategies, how to evaluate those sources that you find efficiently, how to stay organized, how to structure the literature review, and then arrive at your destination with a complete lit review. The important thing is you can get clarification if you need it. So for those of you who are trying to write literature reviews for a dissertation or a thesis, you have an advisor, you have faculty that you can go to ask for help. If you're working on a publication, you might have an editor that you can look on. Questions that you might ask, things like how many sources? So things like a dissertation or a thesis might require more sources than just a scholarly journal article. What kinds of sources? So in many cases, you want things like peer-reviewed journal articles and works from edited books, but in other disciplines that may not be the case. You may be able to use things like scholarly blogs, or in the sciences, you may use gray literature, things that are not necessarily already published. How you might approach this whole literature review, that might be mostly summary, it might be synthesis, you might do some kind of critique of the existing literature. Should you evaluate? I think the answer is generally yes, unless you're doing a systematic review, in which case you are looking at everything and not necessarily excluding anything. We'll get into that later. Should you provide subheadings? So in many cases, literature reviews may be split into smaller sections. Who is your audience? So that will dictate what kinds of sources you need to use and how much background you need to cover. How exhaustive does it need to be? So I mentioned earlier, things like dissertations and theses are a little bit more exhaustive. What to include and what to exclude. Lots of things that you can ask questions about, and there are people that you can ask them about. You can ask things like your librarian, an editor, an advisor, a faculty member. These are all questions you can ask them. The first step in the research process is choosing a good topic. So choosing a good research question is very important. The more narrow your topic is, the easier it is to limit how much stuff you're including. Do some background research. So it can be very helpful to look at model articles that you can base your structure off of, or at least help inform what your structure might look like. Looking at things like annual reviews, which I'll show you a little bit more about later. Finding those top scholarly journal articles and those journals. Looking at other dissertations and theses in your field. Calls for papers can also be really useful because they can show what kinds of research people are looking for. And looking for seminal works, those top works in your field. That can help you figure out what your structure might look like and what your topic might be. If you have any questions, ask your professors for suggestions. They know what the top works are. They know who the authors are that you should be looking at. It's okay to ask them. Then you can refine your topic. So find your focus. Refine based on what you found in your initial searching. So when you pick a topic, you're not married to it. It's not until death do you part. So every time you read a new article, your topic is probably going to shift a little bit based on what you've read, and that's okay. That's part of the process. By refining it, you might limit the time period that you're looking at. You might have way too many sources and you have to narrow that down. You might limit to specific groups studied, a specific methodology or population. You might add extra search terms if you need to narrow it down or even make it broader. And you might expand your topic if you're not getting enough. Lots of different ways that your topic might shift. So I mentioned finding those model articles that you can sort of base your structure off of. Finding other literature reviews is not very difficult. So I have an example here in Academic Search Complete. It's a broad database, and you can search for literature review or review and whatever your topic might be. And you can find other review articles that you can use as a basis to help build your lit review. You can also look at annual reviews. You can search on the library's eJournal tab for annual review of blank, and you can find lots of annual reviews on our A to Z database list. You can also find the annual reviews database where you can look at those as well. The hard part, I think, for a lot of people, how do you even begin to search? So we're going to talk a little bit about how to develop effective search strategies. There are many different ways that you can search, but this is going to be a very quick overview. Know your vocabulary, know what kinds of jargon your field uses, and use that vocabulary to get the results that you want. Know how to use things like subject searches, how to use Boolean, how to use truncation. We're going to go over a little bit of that if you're not familiar with that. Knowing how to limit and sort results. So if you've never used a particular database before, you might not know how to limit the results, what kinds of filters they might have to get your results more specific. Figuring out the best subjects and keywords. So a lot of that's from just practice, looking at what subjects are attached to articles that you found, and also just trial and error with keywords. You can also ask your librarians and we can help. Finding those prominent authors and journals. I'm going to show you a little bit on how to find that later. Looking for trends, and don't just pick the newest articles. Just because it was published yesterday doesn't mean that it's directly relevant. On the same sort of vein, avoid tangentially related articles. Just because it mentions something related offhand doesn't mean you have to include it. So sometimes you can find a stronger argument from a different article. Write down the searches you've tried and where you've tried them. I'm going to show you our search log template that's going to help you keep track of that better. So some different search techniques. You can search by subject. So by default, most of our databases search by keyword. So that's searching anywhere in the text that mentions that word. It might be in the abstract, it might just be mentioned offhand somewhere in the text. Subject searches are the aboutness of the article. It's not just mentioned offhand, it's the core focus. So subject searches can sometimes be a little bit more focused. Boolean is a strategy that you can use to either expand or limit your results. So you can search for "and" in between words. That's going to give you fewer, more specific results, or is going to give you broader and more results. "Not" is going to throw stuff out. If you're getting things that are irrelevant, you can put "not" and throw out that keyword. Truncation is also really useful because databases require very specific keywords to get the results you want. You want to try to capture any variations that there might be. So I have an example here for interaction or interacting. If I put "interact" with an asterisk at the end, in most of our databases, that's going to pull back any variation of letters that come after that, that's going to capture any of those things that build off that root word that maybe would have gotten excluded if I didn't use that wildcard search. Where do you even look? So choosing databases is also really important. Now that you know the search strategy, where do you even look? Unfortunately, there is no silver bullet. There is no one-stop shop database that you put in a search term and you get everything that you want. It's going to take a little bit more than that. Things that you can use to help find those are things like the LSU Library's A to Z databases list. It's linked on our homepage. You can also sort that by subject, so you can narrow it down just to the ones that are really relevant for your discipline. The catalog for LSU Libraries is going to pull back things like books and ebooks and e-journals, searches things that are considered print holdings at LSU. WorldCat, if you've never used it, is also linked on our homepage. WorldCat is basically the catalog for everyone. So it searches not just what we own, but also things at other libraries that you can get through interlibrary loan. A lot of you will probably take advantage of that, especially for things like dissertations and theses. And Web of Science. So Web of Science is an index. It's really useful for the sciences. It has a lot of great features for finding citations, but it's limited in its content for humanities and social sciences. So depending on your discipline, that's going to dictate whether or not you would really use that. How do I find those prominent authors and works and publications? There are a lot of different ways. One of the most useful things that you can do is if you find a good article, something related to your topic in a search, mine it for all that it's worth. It's not cheating, it's being resourceful. So there are sort of two strategies for looking at citations. There's forward chaining and backward chaining. So forward chaining is looking at who has since cited that article that you're reading. So you can find more recent publications that are related to that topic. You can use things like Google Scholar or Web of Science's cited reference search. I've got a little picture here for Google Scholar. So I search for a title and then that cited by count. When you click on that, that shows you all of the articles that Google Scholar has indexed that have since cited that article. So that's a really good way of finding more recent related research. Backward chaining is looking through the references of an article you found and going back and looking at who they've cited and looking backwards. So that's just as simple as I look through the references, I look at that article, and I go backwards. That's a good way to sometimes find who that top author is. If I'm finding lots of articles and they're citing the same person, maybe I need to read that article. I've also linked Ulrich's Web and journal citation reports. Those are really useful for identifying top journals and top publications. You can figure out things like journal impact factor. That can be really useful for identifying that top journal, but also if you're looking into publishing, what journal you might want to publish in. And also ask your professors. They generally know their field. They know who the top authors are. They know what articles maybe you want to take a look at. Ask them. They're an invaluable resource. I mentioned that search log. Track your searches. Make it easier to retrace your steps. Do not reinvent the wheel. So things like this search log that I have here can be a great way to keep track of both really good and really useless searches. So you either can redo that search in another database or never use those keywords again because it got you nowhere. So I do this when I'm searching. If I find an effective search, I write it down, put how many hits it was, what database I looked in. That way I can take that same search strategy and look in other databases. Or if I got no results, I write that down and know I don't need to use that keyword again. So this can be really useful. You can also set up alerts. Things like Cite You Like and RSS feeds help you keep track of searches so you don't have to do them over and over again to find more stuff. You can do saved search alerts in most databases, where let's say you did a search in Discovery, which is our main search bar on the library's homepage, and you really like the results you got. Usually on the top right-hand side, there's a drop-down menu where you can have email alerts sent to you that notify you when new things have been published that would have fit that search criteria. So that way you don't have to search over and over. You can also get publication alerts. Many journals on their own homepage have a way to subscribe and get updates when new issues come out. But at some point, you have to stop. You've got to call it quits. There's no way that you could include all information that's ever been published. A good article is a done article. So eventually you do have to call it quits, but those are all strategies to help you sort of find as much as you can. So if you've found as much as you can, how do you read all of those articles efficiently? So I am a big proponent of not reading beginning to end every single article the first time I see it. I don't think it's a particularly efficient way of reading. I tend to think when you're going through your search results, read the abstract. The abstract is basically a summary plus spoilers. It tells you the background, the reason for the research, what the thesis is, what population it's looking at, what its methods were, and what the findings are. If the abstract is not relevant after you read it, the article itself is not going to be relevant. So if it's not, move on. If it is, keep reading. Next step, I usually think look at the intro and the conclusion. So your introduction is going to give you the background as to why this is being done, give you some context, and the conclusion is going to give you some context for the findings and what it means for research. If it's not relevant, move on. If it is, read the methods. So for example, if you are working in communication sciences and disorders, and you are looking specifically at interventions having to do with children, if I read through an article, it sounds really good, and then I get to the methods and they're working with adults, it's not relevant to my topic. I don't need to keep reading. But if it is, then I can move forward. And then I read the results, figure out what the findings are, go through the references, and then you can read from beginning to end if it was really good and take notes. But this is a much more efficient way to make sure that you are not wasting your time, because there are too many articles to waste your time on reading something, getting to the end and realizing that you didn't need to read it. So how do we evaluate the sources that we read? There are a lot of different ways. One of the important ways is it scholarly? So in many disciplines, you're looking for things like peer-reviewed books and peer-reviewed articles and edited books. In a lot of instances, maybe you are looking for other stuff like gray literature or scholarly blogs or whatever it might be, poetry. But that's something that you can consider if that is a criteria that you need to meet. Is it a primary, secondary, or tertiary source? So tertiary sources are things like dictionaries and reference books and encyclopedias. They give background information. Unless you have an audience that doesn't know anything about the topic, which is highly unlikely, you don't need those sources. Date of publication. So that can be relevant if you need something that is more current. That's one way that you can weed out older sources. Maybe you can find something newer, especially if you've got two people sort of making the same argument. Relevance and value. So is it directly relevant to your topic? Is it really providing any new insight? If it's not, it probably doesn't need to be included. Who is the author? So this sort of comes twofold. So you might have that sort of preeminent scholar, that expert on the topic that you really want to include, and they've got the credentials. And you may also be looking to include certain voices. So you may have a quota for, I want to find a certain number of authors of color to include in my literature review, something like that. Those are things that you can consider when you're evaluating. And also, is it objective? Is it coming from a place of bias, or is it objective? That's something you can use to evaluate. You're not only evaluating each of the individual sources, you're also evaluating what they're like as a whole together. What connects all of them together? What solutions do they each suggest, and how do they differ? What aspects are missing? So this is where you can sort of identify the gaps in the knowledge you might fill. How is the material presented? Do they have different kinds of theories or different methodologies you could talk about? And what kinds of trends and debates do you notice, and how can you sort of pit them against each other, making that conversation happen? and figuring out whether or not somebody really fits into that conversation or whether you can sort of ditch it. Organizing your sources. So I know that many of you probably like to have the big print stack of things so you can read through. It's often a lot easier to read in print, or you might have bookmark tabs. However, if you like something that will keep it all in one place and you can manage it all on one device or different devices, things like citation management software can be really useful. I have a few examples here, Zotero, EndNote, and Mendeley. They're all a little bit different. You can go to our Using Citation Management Software guide on the library's page to sort of figure out which one is most suitable for you. But they serve as a place to keep track of your sources where you can take notes, you can share them with colleagues. It works within most databases, and a lot of them just have an extension for your web browser where you can find an article, save it with one click, and it can help you generate citations and keeps it all in one place. So if you need help with that, reach out to your subject librarian and we can help you out with figuring out which one would be a good fit for you and how best to use it. So we found all of our sources. We're now at the stage of figuring out how to structure this thing. So structuring a literature review often looks like any other essay you've probably written. It has an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. Not always, but often. So your introduction introduces the main organizing principle and why you've organized it in this way. And then in the body, you have that discussion and synthesis of sources where you're talking about that conversation. And then you have a conclusion. What is the state of the literature and what is missing and how do you move the conversation forward? You don't necessarily introduce yourself yet, but this is where you introduce the stage at which your argument can come forth. There are a lot of different ways to structure it. These are just a few examples. You could go chronologically, especially if you're looking at a history of something, how things have changed. You can look by trend, so maybe how practices have changed. You might look thematically, organize it by different themes, talking about those subheadings in a literature review. Has it gone through some kind of thematic reinterpretation over time, some kinds of methodological structures where you can look at different contexts, different population, different survey instruments. You can sort of make that conversation happen that way. You can look at arguments. I talked about pitting them against each other. You can look at those debates and see who comes out on top. You can also look theoretically, organize it by different theories. You can look at, has it been influenced by feminism or structuralism or whatever your discipline might look at. You can look at how works contribute or amplify or reorient the sort of theoretical discourse. There are also systematic reviews. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. A whole nother ballpark. But this may include current situations or the history of a topic. It may include different methods and standards. There are lots of different ways you can structure a literature review. It just sort of depends on what your discipline is and what kinds of sources you're looking at. I mentioned systematic reviews. Big warning, systematic reviews are very different from regular literature reviews. If you are working with a systematic review, you can almost ignore everything that I've said so far, with the exception of sort of how to save things. Systematic reviews focus more on the journey than the destination. It's more about the process than it is about the conversation that's happening. These are things that take a whole lot of time. They usually have more than one author, several authors. It's sort of a literature review, but in a box. So you're looking at maybe all articles that are within a certain date range from a few different journals that use these specific search criteria in these databases, everything having to do with this topic that fits in this box. And it's exhaustive. You're finding everything in this limitation. So these are a whole lot different. If you need support with those, we have a guide for that. The link is here, guides.lab.lsu.edu/systematic_reviews. You can find that on our homepage as well. They're very different. A lot of you probably will not do these. It's very common in the sciences, starting to become more common in the social sciences. But view that guide, and if you still need help, make an appointment with your subject librarian. Okay, so we figured out the structure. Last step is to write it. So you are going to use those sources to support your argument, but you're keeping your own point to yourself at this point. This is not where you introduce your argument. As I said earlier, you are setting the stage for how your argument fits in, so that way it's obvious that your argument comes next. You're looking at how the scholarship converses amongst each other, looking at all the different themes that you might find. It's okay to be critical. Don't take everything authors say at face value. You can be critical of their research design. You can be critical of their conclusions. You can be critical of their limitations. That's the point, is to identify where they may have been lacking and how you might fit in. Don't rely too heavily on secondary sources. So if you can find original research, that's what you want to base your information off of. It's not desirable to find an article that cites somebody else but still cite that article you found. Go back to that original source. That's who you want to cite, because you don't want to rely on that source's interpretation of another source. Use evidence. So if you're going to make claims that are critical, they should be based off of evidence that you found. Use quotes sparingly. So a lot of you may struggle with using too many direct quotes or not knowing how to paraphrase properly. What I think is most helpful is, as you're going through articles, sometimes just jotting down at the top or taking notes in a PDF about what the big findings are, what's unique about this based off of what you read, what a really interesting finding was that's unique. Write that down. That way it is in your own words, and you don't have to worry about trying to find a way to tweak a quote to make it sound like you wrote it. Just focus on what they're contributing and fit that in. Use quotes sparingly. I like to say that your sources are like your hype men in a rap battle. They're there to back you up. They're not here to rap on your behalf. That's your goal. So use quotes sparingly, find ways to sort of introduce the argument without having to sort of paraphrase so much. Still cite though. And revise, revise, revise. It is very unlikely that you will sit down and write a whole literature review in one fell swoop and not have to change anything. It's okay to have to make changes, even to get rid of sources. So revising is a big part of it. And you have arrived at your destination. If you have any questions about the literature review process, figuring out what databases to use, effective search strategies, how to use some of these citation managers, how to save search alerts, anything having to do with the research process, ask your librarian. Your subject librarian's contact information can be found on the library's homepage under subject specialists. You're more than welcome to email me for questions. My email is there, boneal@lsu.edu. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. We're here to help.